Hi, Jim Martin here with the Charleston Parks Conservancy. Thanks for joining me for another segment of Down and Dirty with Gardener Jim Martin. Today we're going to talk about one of the greenest things you can do today, and that's start a compost pile. Now it's time to ditch the dirt. And one of the most indispensable tools that we're going to use in the composting process is what I call the manure fork. And as a kid growing up in northern Ohio, we had a dairy farm, and I was very intimate with this tool, mucking out the barns many days of my younger years. So again, the manure fork is one of those tools. It's not only handy for the composting, but it's also great to move stuff like straw, any kind of piles of material, green material that you have in the garden. I wouldn't really go without this tool in the garden. So why should you start a compost pile? Well, there's probably hundreds of really good reasons to start one, but there's about 3 that I like to go with that are at the top of my list. The first is, as a gardener, we have lots of refuse in the garden, things that we're cutting out all different times of the year. They can be put back into your pile. The second is, if you do any kind of cooking, as a chef or a cook, you have lots of things that are left over, things like eggshells, coffee grounds, all kinds of things that can also go into our compost pile. And the third is that by producing compost, it's a way of amending your soil, adding nutrients back, organic matter that will make your vegetables or your regular garden plants grow beautifully. One of the easiest and most economical ways to start a compost pile is to head on over to one of your home improvement stores and pick up a roll of wire. And you can see with this design here, this is really simple. Anybody can do this. And what we try to tell people is have a pile that starts out about 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot. And so this one is not exactly that, but it's kind of close. It's a little bit taller than the 3 foot kind of thing, but it's a little less long than the 3 foot. But again, these details don't matter so much. I wanted to point out 2 important aspects with the design of this compost bin that are very important to composting. We want to make sure that there's access to air and access to moisture or water. And because of the way that this is set up with all these holes here, it's perfect for that. So we have a structure in place to start our compost pile. Now we need to decide what to put in it. There's really 2 important things, 2 important elements that we need to make the compost pile successful. And those 2 are green things and brown things. And so here's an example of some of the green things that we would find in the garden. You know, there's never a shortage of weeds, are there? So these weeds are perfect green material to add into the pile. Other things that would work, for example, in the vegetable garden, you have, and I have some, this is some leftover cabbage. As you can see, I cut off his little head, and we had cabbage rolls the other night. And so I'm going to take this, and this is going to be added to the compost pile. Other things that you find might be some green things in the kitchen, and this would be leftover lettuces. Other things such as eggshells, and then we have, if you look down in there, some coffee grounds. All perfect things that can go into the compost pile that fit that green sort of idea. So let's look at some of those brown things that you need to finish out that compost formula. And these would be things that, for example, right before spring comes, we're going to be cutting everything out of the garden. There's lots of brown things that have been killed back. Things like leftover fern fronds, perfect material. This is the 4th of July lily foliage that is really turning brown this time of year. Other things that I use throughout the year to augment in the garden would be straw, and this is something that I have around. I use as mulch, but I also add it to the compost pile. One of the things that we cut back during the February period would be our ornamental grasses, and as you can see, there's plenty of material to add to the compost pile with these grasses, and we'll show you how to cut that up in just a minute. One thing that most people don't realize that you can use, there's lots of shreddings in the world, and I also use this in the compost pile, and it worked perfect. So we have our container and we've got things to put in it. Let's show you how to layer it. And I'll start with some green things. And we're going to basically start with one layer of green. And you know, this isn't so complicated that it has to be a certain level of material you put in there. It's whatever you have. So we have a little bit of green put in there. Now we're going to put a layer of brown in there. So we'll start out with some of this material, and in it goes. We're talking about some of the ornamental grasses. With the brown material that's tough and hard, and you would think hard to break down, stemmy. One of the things that I do is I help it along by cutting it into smaller sections. And by doing this, you will find that your compost will break down much quicker. Alright, so we have a little bit of a layer in there with the brown. And then we're going to go ahead and put some of our kitchen stuff. La la la, look how fun that is. Woohoo! Alright, and we're going to put some leftover leaf material here. A little more of the weeds. And you can see the pattern that we have here. So there are a few things that we shouldn't be putting in our compost piles. One of them is anything that's meat. Meat does not break down. It's never something that we should put into the compost pile. So anything that you've been cooking with inside the house, it would not go in the pile. Another thing is any processed product like bread. Bread should not go in the pile. It has things like vegetable oil and butter and those kinds of things that won't break down properly over a period of time. So instead, cut this up and feed it to the birds. Other things that we would not want to put into the pile would be weeds, such as one of my least favorite weeds, which is rattlesnake weed, and they call it there because it's got these little white tubers that seems like it comes up everywhere, and once you have it, you're never going to get rid of it. We would not want to put this into the compost pile because it has the possibility of still hanging on. These tubers last for a long period of time. Those structures seem to never go away. So another one that we wouldn't want to put in the compost pile is things like grasses. And this happens to be Bermuda grass. We would not want to get Bermuda grass in our compost pile because it would not cook down properly, and then you would start introducing this back into your garden. The other thing that we would not want to put in our compost pile are things like pet refuse. No poo-poo in the garden, okay? You don't want to add that to the garden in any way, shape, or form. So stay away from those items. There's plenty of other wonderful things that you can put into the compost pile. So welcome to my compost bins, and as you can see, we have 3 separate bins. And the reason for that is that we have sections that we can have different breaking down going on at different times. So for example, this first one here is some compost that's been breaking down since early fall. And as it reaches a certain level here, I decide that I'm not going to add any more to that. I'm going to let that break down. So then I move to bin number 2. And as you can see, this bin right now has a lot of green stuff in it, so that's just recently been put in there. Probably in the next month or so, this one will also be full, so I'll go ahead and move to number 3. The first one here, within the next month or so, this compost will be ready. So at that point, then I'll go ahead and start adding this to my soil. One of the reasons that you want to turn your compost is so that you can bring more air into it. Air helps break the compost down. Air helps the organisms that are breaking it down do that. So as you can see here, to turn it, all I'm basically doing is just flipping it and mixing it together. And I do this usually about once a month. And as you can see, we sometimes get things in our compost piles that don't like to break down. And this would be a sleeve that was on a flower that ended up maybe not being used, and so it was tossed in here by accident. So we want to keep plastic and those kinds of things out of the compost pile because, as you can see, it doesn't break down. Here's another example. Plant tags, you know, there's all kinds of stuff that gets in there. So we just take that out. But you can see, if you look at these different piles, this is starting to look really brown. Now there's when the compost pile gets to the point where you can't really distinguish specific items in here, then you know it's broken down enough. This is not exactly there yet. It certainly is getting there. You can see a few little things like eggshells still, and this is probably stuff that was the last of what we put in there. Even with this one here, and as I said, we just started this one a few weeks ago, so we're not, it's not really time to go ahead and turn that at this point, but you can see all the different things we got in there. Leftover floral arrangement, stuff from the kitchen, coffee grounds, old banana, you name it, it's in there. Everybody who wants to get into compost asks me, does it stink? If you're doing it right, there's really no smell to it. And I'm not lying to you. It's true. If your compost pile starts smelling really bad, it means that the combination of the brown stuff to the green stuff is not correct. It also could mean that you put some stuff into the compost pile that you shouldn't. One of the other questions I get all the time is, what about like animals in the neighborhood, or your dogs, or any kind of beasts that are coming into the garden? How do you keep them from getting into the compost pile? Well, you can see with the design that we have here, we've done it in such a way so that we can add segments as we add more compost, or we can just keep it in there all the way, so that once it's in place and we have a top, nobody can get in there. So where should you site the compost pile? Well, we've already talked about the fact that if compost is done correctly, it's not going to smell, so that shouldn't be the issue. One thing I tell people is make sure you site it where you're actually going to use it. If you have lots of kitchen scraps, place it someplace where it's convenient for you to walk out the side door and dump into the compost pile. If you make it difficult for yourself, you're more than likely not going to compost. One of the second issues that you might have is the idea of what to do when we have a drought or we have dry periods in the year, because water is an important element to the breaking down of the compost. So during those times, I use the garden hose. Yes, I just add some water, and what I'll do is if it's really dry, I come in usually maybe once a week and I'll just water it down. But for the most part, you know, composting is an easy thing. This is not complicated, just a few things to remember and you're on your way. So we've talked about this whole wonderful process of composting. Here's 3 tips to remember. The first is, make sure you build a compost pile that allows air and water to move through it. The second one is, make sure that you have a good combination of brown and green items. And the third is, when the compost is ready, put it into your garden. That's the whole point of it. Above all, don't make it complicated. Composting is one of the most natural things that happens every day in the world, and we're just helping it along. Thanks for joining me for another segment of Down and Dirty with Jim Martin. I'm with the Charleston Parks Conservancy, Park Angel number 11. Learn more about the Conservancy, tutorials, resources, our classes at charlestonparksconservancy.org. Thanks.